Kevin Borba of Locked On Buffs. I've got my handy-dandy magazine here that tells me all things about the Big 12 this season. Colorado to West Virginia to Kansas, TCU, UCF. And it is Pick Six Previews, Brett Ciencia, Heisman voter, who has game graders and position graders for the Big 12. To start here, he ranks Colorado as the 11th best team in the Big 12 Conference, which, honestly, above Baylor, Cincinnati, BYU, Houston, Arizona State, seems fairly fair from my standpoint. He also includes in here, I mean, there, and I've seen many analysts say, hey, there's a doomsday button where Colorado loses to North Dakota State, Nebraska, and the wheels completely fall off. Are Deion Sanders and Colorado closer to winning the Big 12, or are they closer to losing and finishing last altogether?
Oh, that's a tricky one right there. I think in that particular scenario, I'd have to say probably losing, just because they have such a tough schedule, right? You mentioned it. Open up with North Dakota State. They've won 9 titles from 2011 to 2021. They beat Power 5 teams, or now Power 4 teams, for a living. That's what they do. Kansas State. They beat a top 15 ranked Iowa team not too long ago. They beat Minnesota. They beat Kansas, which, I mean, at the time didn't really mean much, but they did it. And so Colorado has they're very vulnerable, right? Like, you could make a case that Colorado is the biggest boomer bust team in maybe college football, because if they get off to a hot start and they go 5-0, the buzz will be as insane as it was last year when they were 3-0. But if they start off 1-2, then Colorado will be the biggest meme in college football. And I don't think that's fair necessarily, because I do think 97% of teams in college football would struggle with their opening games, right? Like North Dakota State, I would say outside of the Texases, the Georgias, Alabamas, you give any program in the Big 12 North Dakota State to open the year, everyone's probably a little nervy, right? We're all a little nervous to take on the Bison. Like, nobody wants that game. And then Nebraska on the road is always a tough game. It's a rivalry game. It's going to be 100,000 people. Nebraska has a much better quarterback. So Colorado's vulnerable. From the perspective of your question, I do think they have a lot more leaning towards losing. But at the same time, they're the same kind of team, like boom or bust. If all things go right, they're contending for a Big 12 title. But I do think they just have such a tough schedule, and that's what worries me.
For Colorado this season, the transfer portal was huge. And Brett Ciencia of Pick Six Previews lists Dallin Hayden at running back to Will Shepard at wide receiver as two guys who are all Big 12 transfer team. And then on the offensive line, Tyler Johnson, Cleo Benson. Those guys are going to be huge. Defensively, BJ Green, Sam O on the defensive line. It bulks up that unit. What I want to give you, though, we know the transfer portal is a big piece of what Deion does in Boulder. I want to give you his rankings now, with those included on the offensive side. QB unit, number 1 in the conference. Shocking, I know. The running back unit, 15th. Wide receiver, tight end, 3rd. Offensive line, 16th. So there's so much ebb and flow. Skill position, aside from running back, is there. Offensive line is not. How do you assess that assessment? There he goes.
Dude, love the mic. Brett's a great guy. And last year we talked about Colorado extensively, and I really love all of his analysis. My question to you is Colorado's offensive line better than it was last year? Like, without looking at the rankings.
We could put you and me on the offensive line, and it would probably be better than last year's.
Right, exactly. So I think Colorado accomplished quite a bit with a horrendous offensive line. So even if their offensive line is still considered not the best in the Big 12, I still feel like they were in games. Like, they were victims of, I think it was 4 or 5 one-score games that they lost. And so I think this unit's good enough to sort of flip at least 3 of those. And so although their offensive line isn't viewed as, I mean, they're the worst in the conference based off the rankings, but I do think they'll be better. And I think the weapons are just so elite that they're going to kind of mask some of the flaws, right? And I think that's kind of, when you have the top quarterback in the conference, it does mask flaws. Like, we've seen it before. Now, how much does it mask? I don't know. Patrick Mahomes, I think his best season was like 7 wins, right? So depending on what you're looking for, Colorado will shock some people. But I do think that there's a humble or a healthy amount of, like, we got to pump the brakes on them in these rankings, right?
Let's talk defensively, Kevin. 19th in the country in return production. That's 75%. That is good. The problem is, when your return production was bad last season, you've got to reconcile with that, because the scoring defense was 124th in the country. The points per play defense, total defense was 130th. There are barely that many schools in Division I football, Division I FBS, that is. Passing defense 127th as well. Rushing defense 110. Let's give you the unit rankings from Ciencia. Defensively, as he says, Colorado has the 16th, make it the fourth, that's 16th offensive, fourth best defensive line, 11th best linebacking core, 12th best DB unit. That fourth best D line shows me a lot. It's going to give you more leeway for a secondary that might not be as experienced. How do you assess that assessment?
I like the defense line assessment. I think they got a guy like BJ Green was an all Pac-12 guy last year, had 6 sacks. They took both of Pitt's best defensive linemen last year. They had, I think it was like 5 and 4 sacks respectively. Really good. I think they're going to be a lot better at stopping the run. They got Chirozi Nwankwo from Houston, who is someone undersized, but he goes by the block bully. He's there to get dirty in the trenches, to get dirty in the middle, and they're going to be more physical. And so we talked about that returning production not being good. I would say, and this goes for the offensive line too, but the defensive line specifically, all the guys that started last year, I don't expect them to start. Like, I think it's going to be a brand new unit. And so those guys just went from your key starters to depth pieces. And I think sometimes it's okay to admit that not every role is right for everyone, right? Like me and you, we're not going to be out there rushing the passer ever. That's just not us. But maybe we could find a nice little job passing out waters or something. That could be us, right? And so I think realistically, Colorado's defense line is going to be much, much better, and that could keep them in a lot of games. And the secondary rating caught me off guard. I do think it's probably a depth issue there. Whenever you have Travis Hunter, I do know he had some struggles, but you have Travis Hunter, DJ McKinney, who started at Oklahoma State. He did pretty well, I would say. And then Preston Hodge from Liberty was one of the highest graded transfers at PFF. So I do think that maybe there's a little room for a bump in the secondary. I think they could surprise some people, but it's probably more of a depth issue rather than a first-tier talent issue on the starters, I would say.
From the Big 12 perspective, if you told me that Colorado is going to beat, and they don't even play all of these teams, but let's just say hypothetically that Colorado beats Baylor, Cincinnati, Arizona State, BYU, and Houston, I wouldn't be shocked. There's not one of those teams that I would say, no, they are squarely better than Colorado. If you told me Colorado could beat a Utah, beat a Kansas State, beat an Oklahoma State, I might have to push back at that point. Even UCF, I'd tie into that. Or an Iowa State, Arizona, Kansas. I think there's a pretty clear division in the Big 12 that Colorado marks. Like they're the team that, hey, anybody behind you, you've probably got a pretty solid shot at beating. Anybody in front of you, you're going to struggle with. And again, I go back to the schedule. You start off pretty tough if you're Colorado. And if you're able to build momentum early on, Nebraska, winnable, North Dakota State, winnable. I call those coin flip games. If the coin flips in your favor, if you're looking at 4-1 through your first 5, because you can certainly beat Baylor, then at that point, Colorado has momentum. They're hosting game day again. Everybody's talking about you, and you got a shot to make some noise. Coming up, Deion Sanders. Is he gone after 2024? This is Locked On Big 12, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.